a thick envelope with the local HOA's logo stamped on the front. I hadn't paid much attention to the HOA before, just a few emails here and there, but nothing that seemed serious. However, something about this letter felt different. I tore it open, quickly scanning the contents. It was a formal notice from the Greater Lakeside Homeowners Association. At first glance, it looked like just another request for minor repairs, like trimming the hedge a little shorter or repainting the mailbox. But as I read further, my eyebrows furrowed. The letter didn't just ask me to take care of a few small things. It demanded I make immediate changes to my property. They claimed that my fence was too high and my front yard too wild. There was also a mention of my porch decor, which they said didn't adhere to community aesthetic standards. There was no mention of what these standards were, but I knew it was just a vague excuse for them to micromanage. The letter ended with a warning that if I didn't comply, I'd face escalating fines, and the HOA would take further enforcement measures. I sighed, feeling the familiar frustration creeping in. As a police chief, I had dealt with much more serious threats than this. I knew better than to let a letter like this rattle me. I tossed it aside with a dismissive mutter under my breath, just another HOA trying to flex their non-existent muscle. But as I got back to work, I couldn't shake the feeling that this might not be the end of it. The tone in the letter was oddly insistent, and the fact that they'd given me a deadline to comply, without even so much as a phone call or visit first, made me think this wasn't going to be as simple as ignoring it. I had a strong hunch that this HOA wasn't going to back down, and I wasn't the type to let anyone walk all over me. I had barely finished dealing with the rest of my morning tasks when, just a few days later, I was jolted from my focus by the sound of a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I walked over, peering through the peephole. Standing there were two men, both dressed in what appeared to be full police uniforms. I had been a police chief for long enough to know the difference between real officers and impersonators, and something about the way they stood there made me uneasy. They weren't here for a routine check or to respond to a call. They had an air of authority that felt too forced, too deliberate. I opened the door with a neutral expression, ready for whatever they were going to throw at me. "Good afternoon, sir," one of the men said, holding out a clipboard. "We're here on behalf of the Greater Lakeside Homeowners Association. We're conducting an inspection of your property for compliance with community standards." I narrowed my eyes. "You're conducting an inspection? Without any prior notice or a warrant?" The man smiled thinly, as if he was trying to charm me, but there was something off about his smile. "We're following up on some previous notices. The HOA has granted us the authority to inspect your property for violations." I crossed my arms. I had been through plenty of confrontations with criminals and imposters in my years of service, but this situation felt different. They weren't acting like any enforcement officers I'd ever met. They were too rehearsed, too stiff. "You have no legal authority to inspect my property without my consent," I told them firmly, my voice holding steady but firm. "If you're from the HOA, you're welcome to take your complaint up with me in writing. But you're not stepping onto my land without a warrant." One of the men exchanged a glance with his partner, but neither of them moved. There was a tense silence before the one with the clipboard spoke again. "Sir, if you continue to refuse, we'll have no choice but to escalate this matter. You're creating a legal obstacle." I could feel the tension rising. This wasn't just about property violations anymore. They were pushing it, testing how far they could go with intimidation. "You can escalate all you want," I said coldly, "but until you have the proper documentation, you're trespassing." The two men paused for a moment, then turned to leave without a word. But before they left, the man with the clipboard turned to me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll be back," he said. I watched them walk away, a sinking feeling settling in my gut. Though I wasn't going to let this go. I had a strong feeling they'd try to push harder next time. I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't about to let them intimidate me or my family. The encounter with the two fake officers should have been a warning, but I wasn't about to let them think I'd back down easily. However, when a few more days passed without any sign of them returning, I started to think I might have been wrong about how far they'd go. Maybe they had realized that their little scare tactics wouldn't work on me. That illusion didn't last long. It was a Saturday afternoon when the situation escalated again. I had just returned home from a meeting and was unloading groceries when I saw a large black SUV slowly rolling up my driveway. My stomach tightened instinctively. I had seen enough of these types of operations during my career to know when something wasn't right. The SUV came to a halt, and out stepped 4 more men, all dressed in tactical gear. They weren't even trying to hide their intimidation this time. One of the men, tall with a deep voice and a heavy jaw, approached me first. "Good afternoon, Chief," he said, using my title as though it were a taunt. "We're here to conduct another inspection of your property, per the HOA's instructions." "It's a follow-up from last time. I told you already," I replied, my voice hardening. "You don't have the right to inspect anything without a warrant." The man smiled in a way that was both condescending and cold. "Let me remind you, sir, the HOA has the right to enforce community standards. You've received multiple notices already. If you continue to refuse, we'll have to escalate the matter further. You won't want to make this harder on yourself." I didn't even flinch. "I'll say this once again, leave my property, or I'll call the sheriff and report you for trespassing. You're not fooling anyone with that HOA Police Act. You're nothing but a bunch of hired muscle trying to force people into compliance." The man's smile faltered for just a split second, but it quickly returned as he stepped closer. "You're making a mistake, Chief. We don't want to make this more difficult than it has to be." That's when I saw the subtle movement from the other men. One was holding a camera, filming the scene, while the others were subtly positioning themselves. I had dealt with enough shady tactics to recognize a setup when I saw one. They were hoping to provoke me into doing something that would give them an excuse to escalate the situation even further. But I wasn't about to let them get the satisfaction. I reached for my phone and made the call to the sheriff's department while keeping my eyes on the men. "I've got intruders on my property claiming to be part of an HOA enforcement team. They're trying to bully me into compliance with fabricated violations." As I spoke to the dispatcher, I made sure to continue standing my ground. The men seemed to realize that I wasn't going to budge, and after a tense silence, they began to retreat slowly, mumbling under their breath. "This isn't over, Chief," the man with the deep voice said as he backed away. By the time the sheriff arrived, the SUV was gone. But I knew this wasn't just a passing annoyance anymore. The HOA's tactics were escalating, and if I didn't act fast, this could turn into something much more dangerous for my family and the community. After the second confrontation with the fake HOA police, I knew I couldn't afford to just sit back and wait for them to make their next move. Something about their actions, how they were acting with such boldness and disregard for the law, told me there was more at play than simple neighborhood enforcement. They weren't just targeting me. They were targeting anyone who dared to stand up to them. As a police chief, I had learned to trust my instincts. And right now, they were telling me that this was much bigger than just an HOA trying to clean up the neighborhood. These weren't real officers, and the HOA wasn't merely concerned about a few property violations. They were running a scam, and I needed to get to the bottom of it. I spent the next few days digging into the HOA's past actions, using my connections to gather information. I started by looking into the HOA's financial records and the names of those involved: board members, contractors, anyone who could be tied to the enforcement team. What I uncovered shocked me. The HOA had been involved in more than just mild neighborhood complaints. They had been quietly pushing for residents to sell their homes, using aggressive tactics, fake violations, and harassment as leverage. I found records of properties that had been sold under pressure and developers who had ties to the HOA, buying land at rock-bottom prices. The more I dug, the more it became clear this HOA wasn't about enforcing community standards. They were using their so-called enforcement to drive people out of their homes for one reason: to make money. I knew I had to act fast. They were preying on people who didn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back, and as a police chief, I couldn't let that continue. I started compiling a list of all the people who had been wronged by the HOA. I wanted to make sure I had everything lined up before I took action. But then, just as I was piecing it all together, I got a disturbing phone call. My spouse had received a threatening message from one of the fake officers. The message was clear: if we didn't stop fighting back, things would get much worse. They were threatening my family now, and that crossed a line I wasn't willing to ignore. I had all the evidence I needed. The HOA was running a fraudulent operation, using intimidation to profit off homeowners. But now they had gone too far. I wasn't just going to expose them. I was going to take them down. The moment I heard about the threat against my family, a cold rage settled over me. I had dealt with dangerous criminals, corrupt officials, and shady characters during my years as a police chief, but this crossed a line I couldn't let slide. Threatening my family wasn't just a challenge to me as a man, but as a protector of the people under my care. That evening, after the phone call, I immediately informed my spouse that we were taking additional precautions. I called in a few trusted officers from my department to set up surveillance and increase security around the house. My team was already on alert, and we'd make sure no one would feel unsafe in their own home. But what really hit me was the audacity of it all. These so-called HOA enforcers were pretending to be law enforcement and using threats to push people into selling their homes for a fraction of their value. And now they were trying to intimidate me by targeting my family. The more I thought about it, the more I realized just how far they had gone. This wasn't a local power trip anymore. It was a full-on organized operation that had been going on for far too long. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. This wasn't just about a few fake police officers or a corrupt HOA anymore. It was about ensuring that people's lives weren't being destroyed for profit. I couldn't let it continue. I had to expose them, and I had to make sure they never harmed anyone else again. The next morning, I went into full investigation mode. I pulled up all the evidence I had gathered so far: surveillance footage, documents, the threatening message, and the illegal practices the HOA had been involved in. I started organizing it all and building a case against them. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about putting an end to the HOA's reign of terror. But I wasn't going to take this fight alone. I knew I needed to bring in additional support. I called the sheriff's department and a few trusted legal advisors. I also reached out to the media, knowing that once the public knew about the fake police and the HOA's tactics, the pressure would mount and the truth would be impossible to ignore. It was time to take the fight to them, and I wasn't about to back down. The clock was ticking. The more I thought about the threat against my family, the more determined I became. I wasn't about to let this HOA continue to operate like a lawless organization, using intimidation and illegal tactics to take homes from unsuspecting families. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one. I started by gathering every piece of evidence I had on them. I went through the security footage again, this time with a more critical eye, isolating the moments when the fake officers showed up, attempting to bully and intimidate me. I made sure I had every detail documented, from the tactics they used to their mannerisms, everything that proved they weren't legitimate law enforcement. Next, I turned my attention to the HOA's records. Using my connections, I gained access to internal documents and email chains that exposed how they were systematically targeting homeowners. They had been falsifying violations, using community aesthetic guidelines as an excuse to force people into selling their homes for a fraction of their worth. Some of the documents even revealed secret deals with developers who were eager to snatch up properties for future development projects. I had the evidence, but there was more to do. I knew the HOA wouldn't stop unless we hit them where it hurt, legally and publicly. I met with my legal team, preparing the case. We discussed everything: the fake police operation, the fraudulent transactions, and the evidence of harassment. It was clear the HOA had violated a host of laws, but I also knew they would fight back. They had the money, the power, and the influence to drag this out for as long as possible. Still, I was ready. With the legal groundwork set, I also reached out to a few trusted journalists who had been following the HOA's activities. If we exposed the corruption to the public, there would be no turning back. I wanted the entire community to see what they had been up to. The more people who knew, the harder it would be for the HOA to keep operating in the shadows. Once everything was in place, I scheduled a meeting with the sheriff's department. We were going to make sure the fake police officers were arrested, the HOA board was held accountable, and the corrupt developers were investigated. This wasn't going to be a quiet battle. It was going to be a full-blown legal and public war. As the day of action drew near, I felt the familiar weight of responsibility. I wasn't just fighting for myself or my family anymore. I was fighting for the whole community. No one else would have to face what I had gone through. Not if I could help it. The day had come. Everything was set in motion. I had gathered all the evidence, coordinated with the sheriff's department, prepared the legal documents, and briefed the media. It was time to take action and put an end to the HOA's reign of terror. I knew the fake officers would come, and I knew they wouldn't back down easily. They had no reason to. Up until now, they had been able to operate with impunity. But that was about to change. I had set up a meeting point with the sheriff's department. We'd been tracking the movements of the fake officers, and I had a feeling they'd try to pay me a visit again. Sure enough, as I sat in my living room, reviewing the final pieces of evidence, I saw the black SUV approaching my driveway. The same men who had been harassing me before were back, wearing their fake uniforms and looking as confident as ever. This time, they wouldn't get away with it. I stood up, went to the door, and waited. The moment they stepped out of their vehicle, I walked outside and faced them squarely, making sure to project authority. "We need to talk," I said, my voice calm but unwavering. The man who had been the leader in our previous encounters, tall, with a deep voice and the arrogance that comes with being untouchable, smiled at me. "Chief, I see you've decided to finally cooperate. We're here to conduct another inspection of your property." I didn't flinch. "I'm not interested in your inspections, and you're not welcome here. You've been warned already. You have no right to be on my property, and you certainly aren't police officers." He raised an eyebrow. "That's funny, because I don't see you getting the sheriff involved. Are you sure you want to make this more difficult?" At that moment, I gave a subtle nod, and within seconds, several sheriff's deputies emerged from behind my house, surrounding the SUV. Their presence made the fake officers pause, their smiles faltering. "Actually," I said, "I've already called the sheriff, and I'm placing you under arrest for impersonating law enforcement officers and harassment. You've been caught, and it's time to face the consequences." The men exchanged uncertain glances. The leader stepped forward, but before he could protest, one of the deputies moved in and cuffed him. It was over. The entire operation was crumbling, and now the fake officers were the ones being taken into custody. "We have everything we need to charge you," I said to the leader as he was read his rights. "You've been exploiting people's fear and using fake authority to force them out of their homes." Not anymore. With the fake officers in custody, the sheriff's department began to collect evidence from their vehicle, while I stood there, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a win for me. It was a victory for every resident who had been targeted and intimidated by the HOA. With the fake officers arrested and the evidence of their scam piled up, I thought things were finally going to settle down. But as I quickly learned, the HOA wasn't going to take this lying down. They had too much to lose, and they weren't going to go down without a fight. A few days after the arrests, I received a letter from the HOA's legal team. It was full of threats and legal jargon, demanding I drop all accusations against them, or they would take me to court for defamation and harassment. The letter also included a list of their violations of my conduct, completely fabricated, of course. They tried to twist the situation, claiming that I had been harassing them and disrupting their operations. I had expected this, but seeing it in writing made my blood boil. They were trying to turn the tables, attempting to make me the villain in their scheme. But I wasn't about to let them get away with it. The truth was on my side, and I had too much evidence to let them distract me with their lies. I quickly reached out to my legal team, and together we prepared for the inevitable court battle. This wasn't just about defending myself anymore. It was about making sure the HOA paid for their fraudulent activities. The people they had hurt, the families they had intimidated and pressured to sell their homes for pennies on the dollar. This was a fight for justice, and I wasn't backing down. In the meantime, I worked with the sheriff's department to ensure the arrests were moving forward. The fake officers, once high and mighty in their false authority, were now in the custody of real law enforcement. And the deeper we dug into the HOA's records, the more we uncovered shady deals with real estate developers, forged documents, illegal property transfers, and the list went on. It wasn't just a battle for my family anymore. It was a fight to dismantle the corrupt system they had built and make sure no one else fell victim to their schemes. The court date was set. The HOA was ready to fight back with everything they had. But I wasn't afraid. I was prepared. I had the law on my side, and I had one thing they didn't: integrity. The days leading up to the court hearing were tense. The HOA's legal team, armed with their high-priced lawyers, had been pushing hard to intimidate me into backing down. They filed motions to dismiss the case, claiming that their actions were protected under local laws and that I had no legal grounds to challenge their authority. They even attempted to file a counterclaim against me for harassment, hoping to throw the case off track. But I wasn't about to let them bully me out of this. As a police chief, I had faced more than my fair share of courtroom battles and shady tactics. I knew how to prepare, how to keep my cool under pressure, and how to let the evidence speak for itself. The morning of the court date, I walked into the courthouse with my legal team. I felt the weight of what was at stake, not just for me, but for the community. The HOA had been terrorizing people for too long, using their so-called enforcers to push people out of their homes, and I was determined to bring them down. As we entered the courtroom, I saw Karen Whitaker, the HOA president, sitting at the front with her smug, self-righteous demeanor. She looked like someone who thought she was above the law. She didn't even seem concerned that we had already exposed her operations to the public. But I knew her confidence was about to crumble. The case opened with the HOA's legal team trying to argue that they had every right to enforce their community standards and that I had been acting out of line by calling them out for their tactics. They claimed the fake police officers were part of a legitimate HOA enforcement team, and they tried to make it seem like I was simply a disgruntled homeowner who refused to comply with the rules. But I had a trump card, the evidence. I had carefully organized every single piece: photos, videos, documents, testimonies from other victims of their harassment. The moment my legal team presented the footage of the fake officers trespassing on my property, planting evidence, and threatening my family, the mood in the courtroom shifted. The judge's face grew serious, and Karen Whitaker's confident facade cracked. When the judge allowed us to present the documents linking the HOA to illegal land deals and fraudulent property sales, it became clear that the HOA was not just overstepping their bounds, they had been running a criminal operation. The judge allowed the sheriff's department's findings to be entered into evidence, and the weight of the investigation hit home for everyone in that room. The HOA's legal team scrambled to mount a defense, but they didn't have the facts on their side. As the day went on, it became more and more clear the case was slipping away from them. The judge even allowed a few victims of the HOA's tactics to testify, each one sharing their own experience of how the HOA had bullied them into selling their homes, using threats of fines and legal action to get their way. As the proceedings dragged on, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. We had done the work, gathered the evidence, and exposed the truth. It was no longer just my fight, it was the community's fight. The lies, intimidation, and corruption were finally being exposed in full. The courtroom was packed, and the tension in the air was palpable. I could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on us: neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out, journalists covering the case, and even the sheriff's deputies who had worked tirelessly to uncover the HOA's fraudulent activities. This was the moment we had all been waiting for. By the time the final arguments were being made, I could sense the shift in the judge's attitude. The HOA's lawyers were running out of excuses. They had attempted to downplay the evidence and spin their story, but the facts were undeniable. The fake police officers, the forged documents, the bullying tactics, it was all there. The more the defense tried to argue, the more the judge seemed to lose patience with them. When the judge called for a brief recess before delivering the verdict, I took a moment to step outside. My mind was spinning, but I couldn't shake the feeling of impending victory. I had put everything I had into this fight, and I wasn't going to let the HO walk away without facing the consequences. After what felt like an eternity, we were called back into the courtroom. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who had been quiet throughout most of the proceedings, finally spoke. After reviewing all of the evidence presented, she began, her voice firm. It is clear that the Greater Lakeside Homeowners Association has engaged in a systematic pattern of fraudulent activity. The use of fake law enforcement officers, intimidation, and harassment to manipulate homeowners into selling their properties is unconscionable. The evidence is overwhelming. My heart raced as she continued. I find the defendant, Karen Whitaker, and all members of the HOA board guilty of fraud, conspiracy, and abuse of power. Additionally, the HOA will be disbanded immediately. All illegal property transactions must be reversed, and any fines levied against residents must be refunded. The room went silent. For a moment, I wasn't sure if I had heard correctly. Then, as the weight of her words sank in, I felt the relief flood over me. This was it, the moment we had been fighting for. Karen Whitaker, the president of the HOA, was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, her face a mask of disbelief. The other members of the HOA were also arrested, their smug expressions gone, replaced by shock and fear. They had believed they were untouchable, but today, the law had caught up with them. The media went into a frenzy, covering the story and interviewing residents who had suffered under the HOA's rule. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up were now speaking out, and the truth was spreading like wildfire. The community felt a sense of justice that had been long overdue. The courtroom victory was a turning point, but was only the beginning of the long road to healing for the community. The HOA, now disbanded and its corrupt leadership arrested, was no longer a threat. But the damage they had caused, homes lost, lives disrupted, and the sense of security shattered, wasn't going to be fixed overnight. In the weeks following the verdict, I worked with local officials, legal teams, and community leaders to begin the process of rebuilding. The first step was restoring ownership of the properties that had been wrongfully seized. Many of the residents who had been forced to sell their homes under duress were now fighting to get their properties back, and we worked tirelessly to make sure that they were compensated for the wrongs they had suffered. For those who were still living in their homes, I helped facilitate a series of community meetings. These meetings weren't just about legalities, they were about coming together as a neighborhood, sharing experiences, and supporting one another. The atmosphere at these gatherings was palpable, filled with gratitude and the determination to rebuild trust in the community. People who had once kept to themselves now opened up, sharing their struggles and fears, and finding solace in knowing they weren't alone. As part of the rebuilding effort, we worked with real estate agents, legal advisors, and local businesses to help families get back on their feet. We even launched a fund to help cover legal fees for those still fighting to reclaim their homes, ensuring that no one would be left behind. I also made sure that the false police officers who had been hired by the HOA were charged appropriately. The evidence we had collected painted a clear picture of their involvement in the HOA's corrupt schemes, and they, too, faced criminal charges for their roles in the fraud and harassment. The hardest part wasn't the legal battles, it was restoring the community's spirit. The HOA had taken more than homes. They had taken a sense of security, a belonging. Now, it was up to all of us to rebuild that, to bring back the sense of peace that had been stolen. Through it all, I stayed involved. I wasn't just a police chief anymore. I was a neighbor, a protector, and a leader. I was there for every step of the recovery, ensuring that justice wasn't just a legal victory, but a personal one for everyone in the community. Months after the legal victory, the dust had finally settled. The once fractured and intimidated community was now thriving again, stronger than ever. The sense of unity that had been lost under the oppressive rule of the HOA was beginning to return. It wasn't just about fixing houses, it was about healing the bonds between neighbors, reestablishing trust, and making sure that no one would ever have to live under that kind of fear again. I remember the day we held a community gathering to officially mark the end of the HOA's reign and celebrate the beginning of a new chapter. We held it in the park near the community center, a neutral ground where all the families could gather without feeling threatened. The weather was perfect, and there was a palpable energy in the air. People were talking, laughing, reconnecting. The food was plentiful, the kids played games, and for the first time in a long while, there was a sense of peace. It was a day of reflection for many of us. I stood in front of the crowd, speaking about the importance of standing up for justice and the strength that comes from unity. This community isn't just about houses, I said, my voice carrying across the crowd. It's about people who look out for one another, who fight for each other, and who will always rise above those who seek to tear us apart for their own gain. We've been through a lot, but we're stronger now. And we're never going to let anyone do this to us again. The cheers and applause that followed weren't just for the victory in court. They were for something bigger. They were for a community that had reclaimed its dignity, for people who had fought back and won. The families who had been harassed by the HOA now felt free again, and they knew they had each other's backs. There was a new sense of pride in the air, a pride not just in the homes we had fought so hard to protect, but in the collective strength we had discovered in each other. Over the next few months, I continued to stay involved, ensuring the HOA's illegal activity wasn't swept under the rug. The media had kept the story alive, and public awareness about the corruption spread beyond our neighborhood. Other communities began to take notice, making sure that nothing like what had happened to us could happen to them. We helped them put safeguards in place, ensuring their own homeowners associations were transparent and accountable. Personally, the experience had been life-changing. It reminded me of the power of justice and the importance of standing firm when something isn't right. But perhaps the greatest lesson of all was learning that sometimes the most meaningful victories aren't won in the courtroom. They're won in the hearts of the people who stand together and support each other when it matters most. As I stood in the park, looking out over the crowd of neighbors I had fought so hard to protect, I knew one thing for certain. The battle had been long, but it had been worth it. We had all emerged stronger, and together, we had secured a future for our neighborhood, one built on trust, unity, and resilience.